I will not be silent while you strip away my dignity. This is not just a phone. It is my worth you are questioning.
It's procedure. Follow the rules.
The crowd leaned closer, breath caught, the air heavy with suspicion and disbelief. Was Justice about to speak or be silenced once again? The story does not end here. She is about to face an even greater challenge. Do you agree with her stand? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to follow for the next chapter. The line at the coffee counter moved slowly. A ribbon of winter coats and shopping bags winding past the smell of cinnamon, pumpkin spice, and fresh espresso. Outside on Michigan Avenue, early holiday lights blink against a sky the color of pewter, and a wind from the lake pressed people indoors. Inside Water Tower Place, the air felt warm and busy, full of chatter, soft music, and the muffled shuffle of heavy shoes. The Saturday before Thanksgiving always looked like this. Families splitting up to hunt for bargains, grandparents claiming seats near the glass railings, teenagers comparing wish lists over hot chocolate. Aaliyah Carter, cheeks pink from the cold, tightened her scarf, checked a small notebook in her palm, and headed for the electronics store with the steady calm of someone who knows exactly why she is here. Her list was short and precise. A handful of components for an energy conversion experiment, labeled in tidy handwriting, each item circled with a small star. She had built versions of the project in a school lab with loaner parts and careful borrowing. Today, she wanted pieces she could test at home over the long weekend while the city rested and the lake steamed in the cold. She paused near a display of adapters and resistors, breathing in the clean, faintly metallic scent of new hardware. Her eyes brightened the way other teenagers' eyes might in a sneaker store. She lifted a package, checked the model number against her notes, and nodded, satisfied. The store's overhead speakers played a mellow standard about winter romance. Down the aisle, a sales associate straightened a row of cables with slow, deliberate motions and kept glancing over. Mark Peterson had worked here long enough to recognize browsers and buyers, or so he liked to tell himself. He moved with managerial purpose, smoothing boxes, aligning labels, picking up a stray twist tie. He noticed the backpack on Aaliyah's shoulder and the worn edges of her notebook, and he noticed her focused, unhurried hands. He also noticed the way some customers looked at her and then looked away quickly, the way suspicion can float in the air without ever taking responsibility for landing. Mark told himself he was only doing his job when he stepped closer and asked, in a voice meant to sound friendly, whether she planned to purchase anything today. Aaliyah answered with the faintest smile, explaining that she was comparing specifications. She showed him her notes, the careful list, the reason she needed this part rather than that one. He nodded, eyes sliding over the words without really reading them, and remained nearby. The store's door chimed and let in a draft of colder air. A woman swept in wearing a wool coat that looked new and a scarf in a shade of winter white that did not know about slush. Victoria Blake held herself the way people do who expect other people to move aside. She spoke on the phone through an earpiece, thanked no one in particular when the associate at the front greeted her, and drifted toward the sleek table where the newest phones shone like ornaments. She lifted one, weighed it in her hand, smiled at her own reflection in the black glass, and set it down again. She placed her own phone into a wide shopping bag so she could test the case with both hands. From time to time, she glanced around with quick, appraising interest, memorizing the geography of counters and faces without appearing to try. The line at the register grew. A father near the wall explained to his little boy that hot chocolate would come after this one quick stop, and the boy's patient nod looked older than his years. A group of college students debated whether to brave the wind for deep dish pizza or grab burgers upstairs. Two elderly women in puffer coats asked a clerk whether he could install a screen protector, and he promised to do it carefully, as if it were his own. Thanksgiving displays winked from window to window. At the entrance, a security guard with a neatly trimmed beard adjusted the collar of his navy jacket against the draft and shifted his weight, keeping an easy eye on the moving crowd. Aaliyah compared a pair of components, noting milliamps and tolerances in her head, the way other students might hum a favorite chorus. Her breath slowed. She enjoyed this part, the quiet work of matching need to item, the sense of a puzzle leaning toward solution. When she reached for her wallet to check whether her gift card would cover everything, Mark's voice floated across the shelf again, polite on the surface, insisting that the store was very busy and that customers who did not intend to make a purchase should consider making room. The words were wrapped in courtesy, but the message pricked. She answered gently that she would not be long. She had learned in school hallways and cafeterias that a soft voice sometimes caused a hard moment to pass more quickly than a sharp one. She slid the selected items into a small handbasket and stepped toward another aisle to find the last piece. Near the display of phone cases, Victoria laughed into her earpiece and described the color she liked as if she were speaking to an audience. She set the new case down and reached into her shopping bag to feel for her phone. Her fingers brushed over a scarf, then a box, then a receipt, and did not find what they wanted. She patted the other side of the bag. Her laugh faded into a thin crease of worry. She reached deeper, then deeper still. The crease sharpened. She set the bag on the counter and began removing items: a folded sweater, a small candle in a holiday tin, a silk ribbon from a boutique one after another, aligning them neatly on the glossy surface. The absence grew larger than the objects themselves. She looked up slowly, letting confusion ripen into alarm. In that moment, the whole floor seemed to hold its breath. Noise thinned to a ribbon. The faint music kept playing, but it had to cross a distance now. People sensed the start of a scene without being told. Heads turned as if connected by invisible thread. The security guard by the entrance lifted his chin a fraction of an inch. Mark's posture straightened, ready for a task he had not been given. A teenager at the end of the aisle paused the video he had been recording for fun and began a new one with more attention. A boy at the counter counted to 3 and stopped because adults stop counting when tension enters a room. Aaliyah noticed the stirring and looked up from her basket. She saw the neat array of purchases on the counter and the empty space where a phone might have rested. She did not step closer. She had been taught by experience that stepping closer can be misread. She stayed where she was, weight on her heels, chin level, hands visible, the way her mother had taught her the summer she turned 13. Her mother's voice lived in her mind like a compass. Keep your hands where people can see them, keep your breath even, keep your words simple and true. She centered herself and glanced once more at her list, which had never looked so ordinary. Victoria's voice rose half a step, then half a step more. She explained to no one in particular that her phone was very expensive, that it contained personal information, that this was unacceptable, that someone must have lifted it when she tried the case. The words arranged themselves into the shape of a complaint and began to harden. Mark drifted closer, concern drawn on his face like a stencil. He asked whether she had checked inside the bag. She said yes. He asked whether she had placed it on the table. She said she thought so. He asked whether anyone had been near the counter. She let her gaze move in a slow sweep that collected everyone without naming anyone. Then she allowed it to stop. The security guard shifted again, as if a chill had tiptoed through his coat. He did not move from his post. He did not need to move to be present. People who have watched enough floors know how to stand still in a way that changes a room. He kept his expression open, his hands low, his voice ready. Mark asked whether the store could call the number. Victoria nodded quickly and offered the digits. Her voice now clipped and precise. Mark dialed. Somewhere in the building, a faint chime might have sounded, but the quiet rose so quickly that no one could say for sure. The call rolled to voicemail. Victoria exhaled sharply, then squared her shoulders as if a decision had made itself. Aaliyah looked at the window and saw the reflection of the holiday lights tremble with the movement of the crowd. She thought about how buttons and switches respond to gentle pressure, how light obeys wires, how energy finds a path. She thought about the small solar cells she had tested in a lab that smelled of cleaner and warm plastic. She thought about her teacher telling her that patience is a power when proof takes time. Her fingers loosened around the basket handle. She waited. Mark stepped toward the center aisle with a kind of authority that is built of habit more than training. He cleared his throat and asked, in a tone that carried to the ends of the small store, whether anyone had seen the phone lying unattended. Faces remained blank in that careful way that keeps strangers safe from each other. He asked again, slower, as if the words could sweep evidence into a pile. No pile appeared. He turned back to Victoria with a professional frown. the sort that promises action. His eyes flicked behind her for 1 second, over her shoulder, past the open door, and into the corridor where shoppers drifted like leaves. The winter wind found its way through the entrance once more and licked at ankles. Somewhere on the lower level, a barista called a name and lifted a paper cup high. The little boy on the wall bench had stopped counting and began to whisper made-up stories into his mitten, stories about heroes who arrived just in time, because that is how children practice courage. An elderly man with a veteran's cap adjusted his seat to face the store, set his coffee carefully on the armrest, and narrowed his eyes, not in suspicion but in caution, the kind of caution that has seen too much and wants no trouble for anyone. Aaliyah's basket held 3 items now. She had found the last resistor she needed and a packet of connectors that would save her time. The gift card in her wallet would be just enough, and maybe she could offer the difference in cash and a smile. She glanced at the line and at the register where a clerk rang up purchases with the rhythm of someone who has learned that steadiness is a kindness. She took 1 step toward the queue, then paused because Mark had shifted again, and because the room had grown even quieter, and because quiet like this can say as much as a voice. Victoria folded her arms, then unfolded them and placed a hand flat on the counter as if feeling for a heartbeat. Her gaze traveled over the people in the nearest aisle with a kind of theatrical focus, the way an actor marks a mark on the stage. The words she spoke next arrived like decorations pinned to something already in the room. She shaped each syllable so that it would carry. She tilted her chin. She let her eyes settle on one face and stay there. The security guard did not move. He did not need to move to know what would happen next. He had watched too many small storms become larger ones because someone pointed first and listened later. He inhaled slowly through his nose and thought about the cold outside and the warmth he wanted to keep inside and the distance between them. The veteran with the cap lifted his coffee and did not drink. The boy with the mitten stopped his whisper mid-sentence because he had never practiced a story where the hero looked like the quiet girl with the list. Aaliyah did not step back. She knew, with the kind of knowledge that lives in muscles, that stepping back can be misread. She let her shoulders square. She kept her hands where they were, on the handle of the basket, fingers loose and visible. She looked not at Victoria, not at Mark, not at the guard, but at the middle distance, where a person can rest her eyes without challenging anyone. She told herself to breathe the way she had been taught, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. She was on the second count when the room tipped. Victoria pointed straight at Aaliyah. That girl took it. I saw her lurking around here the whole time. Silence settled first on the counter, then along the aisles, and finally over the doorway where a breeze had been sneaking in from Michigan Avenue. The words hung in the air like a bell still vibrating. An accusation pointed and sharp, a finger aimed at a quiet girl with a list. Aaliyah Carter felt the familiar hum of the mall drift farther away, as if the music and chatter had stepped into another room and closed the door behind them. She did not move. She let the basket rest against her leg and steadied her breath the way she had practiced for years. In for a slow count, hold out for the same. Faces turned toward her, not with curiosity now, but with the careful, appraising stillness that comes when the crowd decides it is watching a story unfold. Across the counter, Victoria Blake's voice tightened, as if formality could keep panic from spilling. She explained that the phone was very expensive, that it held important contacts and access to accounts, that misplacing it could be risky. She repeated the words important and risky until they sounded like proof of something else. Mark Peterson, standing close enough to smell the faint sweetness of her perfume, made his face into the kind of concern that retail managers practice in mirrors. He asked whether she had checked the bag again. She said she had. He asked whether she might have placed the phone on another table. She said she did not think so. He asked whether anyone had been standing near her. She lowered her voice and let the sentence trail toward the aisle where Aaliyah stood. The security guard at the door shifted his stance but kept his hands open and quiet. He looked like a man who had learned to measure rooms without moving, who could tell when the floor was changing temperature. He glanced toward the hallway where the smell of cinnamon and roasted coffee rose from the holiday kiosk, then back to the bright rectangle of the electronics store, and set his jaw as if to remind himself that a job begins with keeping the temperature from rising too quickly. Aaliyah lifted her chin a fraction. the basket handle pressed into her palm. She could have explained then, could have said that she had not touched the counter where the woman stood, could have named the 3 parts she had chosen, the values and tolerances, the reason her list had tiny stars drawn next to the right lines. She remembered. Instead, what her mother had taught her on a warm evening when fireflies were blinking at the edge of their yard. Speak simply and only when it is time, and let your hands be where everyone can see them. She kept her hands visible. She let that be the first sentence. Mark turned to her with the managerial calm of someone who believes the script still belongs to him. He explained that a customer reported a missing phone and that, for everyone's peace of mind, the store would appreciate cooperation. The word appreciate glowed like a small warning. Aaliyah nodded once. She said she understood. She said she was willing to show what she carried. She placed her basket on the counter nearest to her and removed each item in order, naming them as she set them down. A packet of resistors, a small bag of connectors, a single adapter, her notebook, and her school identification. She opened her backpack slowly and set a pencil case beside the other objects, then unzipped the inner pocket and showed a slim wallet with a card from a teacher tucked into the transparent slot. Her movements looked like careful choreography, the kind that refuses to turn a room into a stage. A pair of teenagers near the register stopped whispering about deep dish pizza and watched. An older couple in quilted jackets paused their conversation about bus routes and weather. Somewhere in the corridor, a coffee order was called with cheerful insistence, and the name echoed in like a word from a different city. A child by the doorway swung his feet and whispered an invented superhero theme to himself, then fell quiet and looked worried without knowing why. Victoria leaned forward, palms flat, and examined the items without touching them. She said the phone was not there, which was obvious. She said it must have been picked up while she was testing a case, which was not. She let her gaze return to the same place it had landed before. The security guard lifted his radio to his shoulder and pressed the button without speaking, a habit that steadied him when words might arrive with too much momentum. Mark asked Aaliyah to step aside so the store could continue assisting other customers. The phrase "step aside" arranged itself like velvet on the surface of something hard. He pointed toward the end of the aisle where a small sign read "Staff Only." Aaliyah looked at the sign and then at the bright floor tiles leading to it. She replied that she would be more comfortable remaining within the open area. She reminded him that she had offered everything in her possession. She suggested, gently, that the simplest way to conclude the matter would be to call the number and listen for a ring. Mark said the call had gone to voicemail and that these situations could be delicate. He gestured again. Kyle Matthews arrived then, as if the gesture had summoned him. His jacket sat slightly large on his shoulders. His hair had the careful part of a man trying to look older than he felt. He nodded to Mark and waited for instructions, fingers resting lightly on his belt. Beside him, Sean O'Connor took his place with the steady certainty of years. Sean's eyes moved over the room once and then returned to the center as if he were tracing a circle and marking its radius. The guard from the entrance stepped in behind them to close the triangle, and the air became a geometry of uniforms and expectation. Aaliyah thought of the experiment she intended to build at home over the long weekend, of how a circuit stabilizes under the right resistance, of how a small element can keep everything from overheating. She chose her words like resistors. She asked Kyle whether there was a place in the store where a lost item might be turned in. Kyle said yes. The counter at the front kept a drawer for wallets and keys, but no phone had been placed there. He kept his voice level and his posture loose, and when he met her eyes, it was for half a second longer than necessary. The kind of glance that means, I see you, even if I cannot say so. Mark nodded toward the back again, this time with the certainty of someone who expects compliance. He said that asking a few questions in the security office was standard, and that the store wished to keep the aisle clear. His explanation wrapped the request in words like safety and procedure. Aaliyah looked down at her school identification, resting on the counter, at the photo taken on a day when her hair would not behave, at the small smile that had been meant for the person behind the camera. She said she would answer questions, but she repeated that the call and a quick review of nearby cameras would save everyone time. The word cameras loosened something behind Mark's eyes. He said the cameras did not cover that corner. He said the images were not easy to access. He said it was not necessary. Victoria folded her arms. She asked how long this would take. She added that the phone contained important company email and that any delay put her at risk. She pronounced the word risk as if the air in the room belonged to it now. The couple in quilted jackets watched her with faces that managed sympathy and distance at once, the way strangers do when they are not sure which direction a moment will lean. Sean took a step toward Aaliyah with the patient steadiness of someone who will not be hurried and does not need to be. He kept his hands loose and visible, and in a gentle baritone he asked whether she would accompany them. He called her Miss, and the courtesy placed a small, solid stone on the side of the scale that favors dignity. Aaliyah nodded. She placed her components back into the basket, closed her backpack carefully, and lifted her school identification with the same respect she used when returning a borrowed book. She walked beside Sean, not behind him, toward the small room behind the counter, where the walls were painted the unassuming gray of rooms that do not expect to be seen. They passed the register, where the clerk paused mid-scan and gave her the smallest smile, the kind that says, "I am sorry," while pretending not to speak. They passed the display where the newest devices gleamed in their cradles, untouched. They passed the doorway where the breeze had made a habit of announcing the outside world. At the threshold to the back, Kyle held the door and cleared his throat softly, as if he had intended to say something and then remembered he could not. Inside, the security room smelled faintly of dry paper and machine heat. A small bank of monitors blinked like a patient waiting for permission to tell a story. A coat rack stood against the wall with 3 navy jackets and 1 scarf looped over a hook, a quiet suggestion that people had believed they would return shortly when they left them there. A chair waited near a metal table. Sean gestured toward it with open palms. Aaliyah sat, straight-backed, hands folded on the table, where everyone could see them. Mark remained standing, close enough to the door to feel the hallway air on the back of his neck, far enough inside to count as present. Victoria hovered near the corner with her shopping bag on the floor and her lips pressed tight enough to leave little white marks. Kyle found a place by the monitors and chose to look busy without touching anything he did not need to touch. He looked like a man measuring the distance between 2 choices and finding it too short for comfort. Sean asked for Aaliyah's name. She told him. He asked why she had come into the store. She explained, and as she spoke about school, a window seemed to open in the room, letting in a little more air than had been present a moment ago. She described the project she had started in the lab and the way she hoped to improve the design over the long weekend while the city grew quieter for the holiday. She did not use technical terms to show off. She used them the way a person uses names for people she loves. She said that she had a gift card and had planned to ask the cashier to ring the smallest items first to be sure she would not owe more than she had in cash. Mark shifted his weight. He did not look at the gift card. He looked at the clock, as if time had become the thing that mattered most. Victoria interjected that the phone had been on the counter when she was testing a case and that it must have been lifted in that instant. She pointed out that the girl had been moving around the cases for a long time. She said lurking, and the word rolled around the room like a marble with a sharp edge. Aaliyah did not respond. She had learned that some words bruise more when they are caught. Kyle moved 1 step closer to the monitors and saw, in the corner of a screen, a reflection that might have been helpful if the angle had been kinder. He beat the inside of his cheek and kept his eyes on the task of looking like a man watching screens. Sean asked whether anyone would allow a call to be placed with the volume turned high. Mark said he had tried. Kyle glanced at the desk phone and thought, for a sliver of a second, about calling anyway, about letting a sound decide what people refuse to let themselves see. He exhaled and did not move. The room held the weight of things not done. Aaliyah felt the sting of being arranged as a narrative for other people. It was a familiar sting, as familiar as the ache in her shoulders after carrying a backpack through cold wind. She named it to herself. Not shame, not fear, but the stubborn sadness of being mistaken for a shape that someone else carved in their mind long ago. She folded the feeling the way she might fold a note and place it in a pocket for later, and then she did what she could do. She asked, quietly, whether an associate could accompany someone to the front and ask the barista to listen for a ringtone. The request sounded almost like a favor for a neighbor. Sean considered. Mark frowned. Victoria lifted a hand as if to shoo away an idea. Outside the door, the mall's holiday music reached a confident chorus. And somewhere beyond the corridor, someone laughed the easy laugh of a person who has found the exact pair of gloves that will make a grandmother smile. The world kept doing what it does. And in the small room, people tried to bend it to their private needs. Sean straightened and said they would step out for a moment and return. He asked Aaliyah to wait. He kept his tone respectful. She nodded. In the hallway, the three security jackets created a small raft in the current of shopping and chatter. Mark leaned toward Kyle and lowered his voice to a whisper that still sounded like instruction. He said they could not have someone making a scene in the store on this weekend, that the manager on duty expected him to handle it promptly, that the right kind of customer would not want to see a long conversation. Kyle answered with a thin yes and thought about his mother, reminding him to let right and wrong be louder than titles. Sean stepped to the service desk and spoke to the associate about calling the number again. The associate dialed. The line rolled to voicemail. She apologized before the beep, as if the apology could arrive inside the recording. Back in the room, Victoria practiced being the wrong party, the way some people practice piano. Repetition made the posture smooth. She murmured words like unacceptable and liability and violation of trust, and each syllable built a small platform beneath her feet. Aaliyah watched the way the words changed the air around the woman. She had seen it before, how phrases could be shaped into furniture a person could stand on, and how difficult it became to ask them to step down. The door opened and let the mall's light back into the room. Sean returned with a face that said a solution had not appeared. Mark straightened, relieved to have motion, and reached for the radio clipped to his belt. He pressed the button with a thumb that looked ready to make something official. His voice emerged calm and clipped with just enough urgency to sound competent. He issued the kind of request that travels through buildings like a winter draft. Acknowledgement crackled back, words wrapped in static and certainty. The store resumed its hum outside, but the hum inside the room changed keys. Kyle looked at the floor, and then at Aaliyah, and then at the floor again. He found his voice, small and quiet, and asked whether she wanted a cup of water. She thanked him and said yes, and the thanks sounded like a decision to remain herself. Sean nodded once, as if to a colleague. Mark folded his arms and counted breaths he did not name. Victoria adjusted the fall of her scarf and prepared a sentence for when more uniforms arrived. A sentence that would make her sound both injured and reasonable. From the radio at Mark's hip, a voice cut through the low noise of the room. Steady, official, and close enough to carry its own gravity. It spoke in the tone of someone for whom procedures are maps. The words were simple and left no room for misunderstanding. Officer Harker is on his way. Hold the scene. Awful, man. The security office felt smaller than it looked from the hallway. A square of gray walls and humming equipment set back from the bright river of shoppers. The door closed with a soft latch that sounded more final than anyone intended. Aaliyah sat on a chair that wobbled only slightly. Her backpack on the floor by her feet, her school identification on the table where everyone could see it. Outside, the mall's holiday playlist carried a familiar melody across the open atrium. But in here, the music thinned to a suggestion. The air smelled of cardboard, copier toner, and winter coats just beginning to dry. The older guard, Sean O'Connor, kept his voice even as he asked her to confirm her name. She answered clearly and folded her hands loosely, palms open. Kyle Matthews stood near the monitors, glancing at the screens and then away, as if looking too hard might make a picture confess to something it had not seen. Mark Peterson lingered by the door and tried to look both concerned for a customer and in control of a situation. Victoria Blake hovered with a tidy posture that said she was ready to be taken seriously. The radio at Mark's hip had gone quiet after the last transmission, but the room still listened to it, the way a room listens to thunder after lightning. The announcement that an officer was on his way held the space between them like a wedge. He arrived sooner than anyone expected. Officer Daniel Harker stepped in with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed predictable steps were the same as correct ones. He removed his gloves slowly, tucked them into his belt, and looked around as if taking attendance. His eyes did not find Aaliyah first. They found Mark, then the older guard, then the woman with the elegant scarf, and only then the girl at the table with open hands. He nodded at no one in particular and asked for a summary. Words poured toward him with the gravity of relief expensive phone, tested cases, missing in an instant, a customer upset, a teenager nearby. He made the small notes of a man recording a story he already thought he knew. When he turned to Aaliyah, his expression did not change. He asked whether she had taken anything that did not belong to her. She said no. He asked whether she had been near the counter where the phone had rested. She said she had kept to the aisle with components, that she had asked the clerk a question about compatibility, that she had then placed items in a basket and walked toward the register. She used simple sentences, because simple sentences do not give people extra hooks to hang skepticism on. The officer's gaze drifted to the open backpack. He asked her to remove its contents and place them one by one on the table. She did, in the order she used in labs. Pencil case, notebook, wallet, components, the slim zippered pouch where she kept a calculator and a small ruler. He inspected each item without touching them more than necessary, put on a pair of nitrile gloves when he did touch them, and then looked at her again as if the absence of one thing proved the presence of another. He asked if she understood the seriousness of the situation. She replied that she did. He asked if she would consent to a pat-down by a female associate. She answered that she would not, but that she was willing to stand and turn her pockets inside out, which she did, steady and precise. A receipt from the cafeteria and a bus pass appeared, as harmless as stray leaves. Victoria's voice entered the room like a string being plucked. She repeated that the phone had been within reach, that she had turned for a second to test the case, that when she turned back it was gone. She did not say that she had placed her own phone in her shopping bag a few minutes earlier so she could use both hands. She did not remember that, perhaps because the story sounded smoother without it. Harker gave her a slow nod that smelled like agreement. He asked Mark about the cameras. Mark said the cameras did not cover that lane well, that the angle was unfavorable. Kyle's eyes flicked to a monitor, where a reflection in the glossy pillar showed movement and shapes without their names. He opened his mouth and then closed it, as if remembering that an incomplete truth can be used as a lever by the wrong hands. Sean cleared his throat and asked whether a call had been placed again with the ringer at full volume. Mark said the line had gone to voicemail. The clerk at the front had already tried. Sean suggested that someone walk the route between this store and the nearest coffee kiosk, with the phone on speaker, listening for a faint chime. Harker lifted a palm, a small stop sign wrapped in courtesy, and said that procedures would be followed here before anyone wandered the mall. He moved closer to Aaliyah, not looming, just narrowing the space the way a person narrows a question. He asked how old she was, and then did the math out loud with an air of disbelief that a 16-year-old could have come this far alone on a cold weekend. He asked about her school. He said he had never heard of the program she mentioned. He asked what she planned to do with the parts in her basket, as if science were a kind of excuse. She kept her voice calm. She described an experiment with small cells and measured current, described the quiet pleasure of watching a needle settle where it should. He did not write that down. The conversation bent without a sound. The words began to feel like they were moving past her rather than to her. The way water slides around a stone it has no time to carve. Harker told Sean to step outside with him for a moment, and they did. Kyle stayed behind with Mark and Victoria. The room breathed differently without the officer in it, as if a trick window had been opened. Victoria used the moment to wonder aloud why someone who had done nothing would be so calm. Mark said something about how certain personalities react under pressure. The sentence hung from a hook of assumption. Aaliyah looked at her school identification again, at the photograph that had not expected to be part of a trial, and then at her own hands, brown and steady, lying open on a table that reflected a coil of light. Harker returned and pulled out a small notepad as if it were a key to a different door. He said that for everyone's peace of mind he would apply a standard restraint while matters were sorted. The phrase standard restraint sounded like a blanket folded at the foot of a bed in a brochure. He took a pair of handcuffs from a pouch with a practiced motion that was almost gentle. He asked Aaliyah to stand and turn. She did. Sean looked at Kyle. Kyle stared at a spot on the wall as if someone had pinned a moth there. The cuffs closed with a click that broke the room's quiet like a pencil snapping. The metal rested cold against skin. She inhaled once, slowly, and thought of a winter's morning at the bus stop, when she had held a metal railing with bare fingers and then learned to let go without panic. The officer checked the fit, she said, as evenly as she could, that they were tight. He adjusted them a notch, not enough for comfort, enough to demonstrate that he had heard the words. He asked her to sit again. She did, hands angled behind her, shoulders a little square to keep the edges from biting. No one raised a voice. The harm in the room arrived dressed well. It arrived with phrases like procedure and for your safety, and this will only take a moment. The older guard kept his hands visible and left them there, a quiet protest measured in posture. Kyle moved to the water cooler and poured a small paper cup without being asked, then set it within reach on the table, half hoping someone would mistake it for a rule and follow it. Aaliyah studied the steam that did not rise from the cold water and decided she would drink later rather than ask for help with a cup she could not easily lift. She glanced at the monitor again and saw her own reflection as a shape seated at a table. The shape of a young woman looked at the shape of a door. She thought about how a diagram is never the machine. The minutes lengthened like shadows in late afternoon. Outside, announcements at the mall marked sales and raffles with bright voices that rolled past like small parades. Somewhere a child clapped for something, happy for reasons that mattered exactly as much as any other reasons in the world. In the room, the officer asked again about the precise path Aaliyah had taken from the entrance to the aisle. He traced it in the air with a pen and let the line stop just short of the counter where the newest devices looked like ornaments. He rehearsed her answers back to her and then folded them in on themselves until they suggested a question she had not answered. She finally said that anything more could be clarified much faster by checking the camera closest to the phone display or by calling the device again. She added quietly that she would also like to call her mother. The officer looked at her as if she had said something too simple for his patience. Sean's mouth moved, then closed. Kyle took a breath and said he would be happy to walk the floor while someone called the number a second time. Harker told him to wait. He studied Aaliyah for another long second and then said that contacting a parent would be appropriate after a brief review of her account. The word after dropped into the room like a brick into snow. She felt it. She let herself feel it. Then she set the feeling down where it would not tip her balance. She replied that calling her mother now would be appropriate, that she was a minor, that her mother would want to be present for any further questions. She spoke without heat. Calm, for her, had never been a performance. It was a discipline. The officer's jaw shifted the width of a coin. He seemed to consider whether the path of least resistance ran through or around her request. Mark watched him the way a man watches a traffic light. Victoria watched with the tight interest of a person who believes fairness is measured by how often the world agrees with her. The radio on Mark's belt crackled softly with other people's business, then hushed again. The city turned under its own weather. The little office kept its temperature. Aaliyah repeated her request once more and added one more sentence, because she had earned it with the steady way she had carried herself. She said that calling her mother would not take long and would make all of this simpler. The officer finally said she could make the call, but that the phone would be placed on speaker. He nodded toward the desk phone in the corner. Sean lifted the receiver, dialed the number she gave him, and then held the phone between them so that the air could witness what it heard. The line connected quickly, a familiar comfort that bloomed across distance. Aaliyah said hello and gave her mother the facts without embroidery. She said they were in the security room of the electronics store at Water Tower Place. She said a customer had reported a missing phone. She said she had been asked questions and had shown her belongings. She said she was safe enough, but that she would like her mother to come. Then she listened. The answer on the other end traveled through the wire like a hand. She nodded once, and with a calm that surprised even her, she lifted her voice so that the room could not pretend to have misheard. She said that her mother was on the way and that she would arrive soon. She paused. Then, because the room was still, because the officer's eyebrows had risen one more notch, because the air was already choosing sides, she finished the sentence that everyone seemed to be waiting to judge. The room burst into laughter when Aaliyah added, "My mother is Colonel Monique Carter." The hallway outside the security office carried the bright shuffle of 1,000 small errands, the smell of roasted coffee and cinnamon drifting in from the open atrium. Inside, the room held its gray composure, the hum of equipment steady as a bedside lamp. Laughter still clung to the air like a thin film after Aaliyah's last sentence, but it faded quickly. The way heat leaves a dish when a door is opened to winter. The door opened again. A woman stepped in, wearing a wool coat, the color of slate, a knit hat folded into her pocket, the lake wind still on her cheeks. Her eyes moved once across the room, not fast, not slow, as if taking a quiet inventory of people and objects, the way a nurse counts instruments before a procedure. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room adjusted to her presence the way a picture frame straightens under a steady hand. She looked first at her daughter, then at the silver bracelets shining where they had no right to shine. Without taking another step, she asked, in the tone that kept the floor level, who had placed restraints on the minor without a guardian present, and on what grounds? The question did not flare. It held. Mark Peterson shifted near the door, the practiced concern on his face suddenly a size too small. Sean O'Connor's hands remained open and visible at his sides, his eyes softening in something like relief. Kyle Matthews straightened by the monitors and felt the word mother settle the way a weight settles a slip rope. Officer Daniel Harker kept his posture even and his jaw set, the manner of a man who believes that the right to command resides in the sound of his own certainty. He asked the woman to identify herself. She stepped close enough to the metal table for the light to catch the small laminate card she drew from her wallet, set it flat beside Aaliyah's school identification, and held it there with the gentle press of 2 fingers. The card said everything it needed to say. She added her name only because courtesy belongs to those who carry it well. Monique Carter. Aaliyah lifted her chin. The tightness in her shoulders loosened a small degree. She said nothing, because the lessons about silence and timing lived in her, the way breath lives in lungs. Monique took in the cuffs again, then the faint red marks beneath them. She asked Officer Harker to remove them at once, so that further conversation could proceed with a basic standard of dignity. The officer replied that a standard restraint had been applied for everyone's safety while a report of theft was investigated. He said the words standard and safety with the careful weight of someone laying down bricks. Monique did not step onto the path he hoped to pave. She asked whether a guardian had been notified before the application of restraints. He hesitated the width of a blink. She asked whether the store's cameras had been reviewed. Mark began to say something about angles. She asked whether a call to the missing device had been made with the volume turned high, accompanied by a brief search of the immediate area. Sean confirmed that calls had been placed. Monique turned to Victoria with a politeness that made rudeness very difficult and asked if she had checked her own bag, pockets, and the counter slowly and methodically. Victoria made a small sound that could have been assent or insult. It dissolved before it reached the wall. Monique's voice did not rise when she spoke again, but the room's temperature changed a degree all the same. She said that her daughter would not answer further questions with restraints on, that a minor had a right to a guardian present, and that the narrowest reading of good sense required urgency in returning to evidence rather than circling suspicion. She suggested, calmly, that the cuffs come off now. Harker's expression arranged itself into the mask of patient firmness that certain men practice for mirrors and for cameras. He said he would be happy to continue cooperating within procedure. He said the restraint would remain while he completed a brief set of clarifying questions. He asked Aaliyah whether she had approached the phone display table at any point after entering the store. Aaliyah answered clearly that she had stayed in the components aisle, had asked a clerk about compatibility, and had then picked up the items now sitting on the table. She kept her eyes on the point over his shoulder, the way a person looks past a swing that has come too close, letting it pass before it can strike. Monique listened without interrupting. When Aaliyah finished, she folded the identification card back into her wallet with that same steady nurse's care, the simple ritual of returning a thing to its place. Then she looked at the officer and said that the restraint would be removed now. The sentence did not wear a question mark. It did not need one. For a second, the room lived at a crossroad. Harker held her gaze. The gray wall seemed to quiet further, the monitor steady as a held breath. In that small pause, the habits of the people in the room rose to the surface. Sean's loyalty to dignity, Kyle's ache to do what was right before he was told to, Mark's need to maintain a picture that would satisfy a district manager, Victoria's preference for narratives that made her the center of consequence. Harker reached to the pouch at his belt and took out the small key. He said that removal would be temporary pending the outcome of the review. He stepped behind Aaliyah and turned the key with a click that sounded less like authority and more like the end of a bad note. The metal loosened. Aaliyah brought her hands forward, careful and slow, and pressed her wrist bones gently with her thumbs to bring the blood back. Monique watched for one heartbeat, confirming the color returning to her daughter's skin, then turned to the bank of monitors where angles sometimes tell more truth than faces. Kyle, invited by a look rather than a word, pulled up the nearest feeds. Grainy squares populated the screen, each a small aquarium of light and motion. The camera near the phone table offered a reflection in polished glass more than a direct view. The camera over the entrance did better, capturing spaces in a rhythm that made sense to anyone who has ever counted steps for a living. Monique asked which tape could be scrubbed back by a few minutes without losing clarity. Kyle's fingers found the keys as if he had been practicing for this measure all afternoon. He rewound slowly. The phone table held its sleek rows like a choir waiting for a cue. A woman in a winter white scarf entered the frame, lifted the device, waited, smiled at her reflection, and set it down. The woman set her own phone into a wide shopping bag to free her hands. The angle did not hold the motion long enough to make a case by itself, but it told a kind of truth, where objects had been at one moment and where they were not the next. Mark said the footage was inconclusive and advised against reading too much into reflections. His voice held the brightness of a person offering a helpful warning about thin ice while hoping no one notices who poured the water. Monique nodded once, as if to say that incomplete truth was still a kind of light. She asked to see the feed from the corridor just outside the store for the same window of time. Kyle slid the cursor with the gentle patience of a man smoothing a wrinkle in the sleeve. The corridor appeared. Holiday lights reflected in the polished floor, bodies moving in winter layers, the open mouth of the store glowing behind them. A woman with a white scarf paused just beyond the threshold, shifted the strap of her bag, fished for something inside, glanced around with practiced confidence, and then continued toward the escalator. Again, not proof, but shape. Through the wall, the mall's afternoon rolled forward. A barista called a name, a child asked for sprinkles, a voice on the public address system reminded shoppers about extended hours before the holiday. In the small room, time moved differently. Monique asked one more question that carried the tone of a checklist rather than a challenge. Whether the store maintained an incident log and whether anyone had noted prior false claims on this floor in recent months. Mark said he would have to check with upper management. His mouth formed the words as if they were a good suit worn one size too tight. Victoria bristled, the silk of her scarf sliding a fraction over the wool. She said it was outrageous to be treated as if her word required corroboration. Monique's head tilted a degree, the expression a teacher uses when a student confuses confidence with correctness. She said that corroboration is what keeps faith with everyone in the room, including the person making the claim. Harker asked for identification from Victoria, and she produced it with the irritability of a person unused to being asked for anything but patience. He took down her details. He asked whether she would consent to a quick search of the immediate area where she had been standing. She agreed with an air of benevolent inconvenience. He directed Kyle to accompany her to the counter. Monique looked at Sean and asked, in that same measured tone, whether it would be possible to walk the few steps to the entrance and call the phone again on speaker. Sean said yes. He looked to Harker for the nod, and to his credit, the nod came. Aaliyah stood when her mother's eyes flicked toward her. Together, they walked to the threshold of the security room. Sean led slightly, Kyle and Victoria just ahead toward the display table, Mark following with a kind of supervisory orbit, and Harker close enough to remind everyone where he wanted the center of gravity to be. The store beyond the doorway looked brighter than it had minutes before, the contrast sharpening the edges of people and things. The register clerk glanced up and then down, the way a person chooses not to stare at a neighbor's private moment. A couple with quilted jackets stepped aside, the small civic choreography of strangers sharing space. At the counter, Victoria resumed her performance. Items out of the bag, arranged neatly, the absence in the middle allowed to grow larger than any object. Kyle pressed the desk phone speaker to a call that ran into the air with the voice of a small bell trying to be brave. The first ring felt tentative, as if uncertain it would be allowed. The second ring sounded confident enough to announce itself. Nothing answered from the table, the floor, the bag. Sean tried to call again from a cell at the service desk for volume. The pair of rings braided with the store's music and passing to the corridor where holiday lights kept their appointed shimmer. The rings went to voicemail as before, and the room accepted the quiet with the practiced politeness of people who have decided to wait rather than act. Monique studied faces instead of glass. She watched the small changes at the corners of mouths and eyes when people tell themselves they have seen enough to decide. She saw the way Mark wanted the scene to end without paperwork, the way Kyle wanted it to end without regret, the way Sean wanted it to end without harm, the way Harker wanted it to end within lines he drew, and the way Victoria wanted it to end where it began, with certainty pointing in one direction only. She turned a fraction and spoke softly to her daughter, a sentence long enough to be heard and short enough to be carried. Breathe and keep your hands visible. Aaliyah breathed. She let her fingers rest on the edge of the metal table by the entrance, palms open again, as if beginning and continuing were sometimes the same skill. When they returned to the small room, the gray walls seemed to have moved in closer by the width of a sheet of paper. The monitors waited. The chair remembered the shape of Aaliyah's shoulders. Harker cleared his throat and began a sentence about cooperating further within procedure. Monique did not interrupt. She waited until the sentence finished itself and then spoke the way a person presses a flat palm over the scatter of papers a draft has tried to steal. She said that the restraint had been inappropriate, that the failure to contact a guardian before restraint had been improper, that the failure to review immediately available footage was unsound, and that the negligence of basic search steps had turned a customer complaint into a harm. She did not shout the word harm. She set it down with the authority of a signature that has been learned over many steady years. Mark's mouth opened and closed, producing only the air of a man who had lost the end of his script. Victoria muttered something about knowing attorneys, and the word attorneys left her lips with the intention of making someone else's shoulders move. Monique inclined her head a measure, as if giving the floor to a child who has just discovered that chess pieces do not all move the same way. Then she lifted her phone and, in a voice quiet as a page turning, spoke into it. She did not hurry. She did not lean on titles for their own sake. She spoke the way a professional speaks to other professionals when the work is clear. There has been an incident at the water tower place involving a minor restraint applied without guardian present, evidence not yet reviewed, cooperation requested, legal and military police support advisable. She ended the call with a simple thank you that carried its own expectation. The corridor outside the door had grown a small crowd. The rhythm of a mall on a holiday weekend knows how to find a story and stand near it without being asked. Two shoppers spoke in low voices about checking cameras. A pair of teenagers lifted their phones and then lowered them, unsure where civility ended and curiosity began. A reporter from a local station passed by with a camera bag on her shoulder, and the easy trot of someone who can smell news the way a baker smells bread. Overhead, the steady warmth of lights made the winter beyond the glass feel like a manageable rumor. Back inside, Monique rested her hands lightly on the back of her daughter's chair, not to hold her in place, but to remind the room that the girl was held by someone who would not move. Harker's radio stirred with a small burst of static, an impatient sparrow in a wire. He glanced at it and returned his gaze to Monique, choosing, for the moment, to pretend he had not heard. She met his eyes with a calm that was not a dare, only a mirror. He considered, perhaps for the first time this afternoon, that a different kind of authority had entered the room, one that did not need volume to be real. The quiet that followed felt cleaner than the quiet before. Monique's voice, when it came again, carried the weight of a final checklist before a switch is thrown. She said that her daughter would now receive medical attention for her wrists, that a copy of any footage available would be secured, that names would be recorded, and that any further conversation would occur with counsel present. She did not ask whether anyone objected. She did not need to. Aaliyah looked up at her mother and saw not a uniform and not a rank, but the shape of a life spent making sure that procedure serves people, rather than the other way around. Gratitude rose in her like a warm breath on a cold morning. She kept it behind her teeth to let it last. Beyond the threshold, someone in the hallway called out about a holiday promotion in a cheerful voice that did not know it had chosen bad timing. The voice rolled away into the larger warmth. The door waited. The room waited. For a long heartbeat, the afternoon held its posture. The door opened, and Major Anthony Brooks, the Army lawyer, walked in with Captain Sophia Martinez of the military police. The security room's door eased inward as if the hallway itself had taken a breath and then decided to step inside. Major Anthony Brooks entered first, a careful economy in his movements, his coat unbuttoned against the indoor warmth, his expression composed like a courtroom bench at rest. Captain Sophia Martinez followed, crisp and alert, a notepad already in hand. The gray walls did not change color, but the air reorganized itself. The hum of equipment sounded less like background and more like a record of facts waiting to be called upon. Aaliyah sat with her wrists free now, the faint redness fading, her school identification still on the table like a small flag planted on steadiness. Monique Carter greeted the newcomers with a nod that needed no ceremony, then outlined the essentials with the clean edges of a checklist: a minor restraint without a guardian, a missing device, incomplete evidence review, and a request to anchor everything in verifiable steps. Brooks acknowledged with a measured yes and asked, without raising his voice, that any footage available be preserved immediately and that a quick chain of custody record begin now, not later. Martinez moved to the bank of monitors, not waiting for anyone to grant permission to protect what might be lost. Kyle Matthews joined her, fingers hovering over the keys, with the poise of a man who had learned not to touch more than he needed to, but ready to move when asked. Mark Peterson stood by the door where he had spent most of the afternoon, close enough to the hallway to call it busy, far enough inside to claim he was fully engaged. Officer Harker kept his shoulders square, the map of his procedure still spread across his tone. Victoria Blake adjusted her winter white scarf as if the angle of its knot could convince the room that certainty belonged where she had left it. Brooks asked for a clean replay of the last 10 minutes at the phone display. Martinez scrubbed back time with deliberate strokes and set the feed to normal speed. The image was not a gift. It offered reflections and angles, polished surfaces that told the truth in fragments. Still, fragments have a way of insisting. The screen showed the sleek table with the rows of new devices resting like a quiet choir. It showed Victoria approach, lift one phone, weigh it, admire her reflection, set it down. It showed her place her own device into her shopping bag to free both hands. It showed small motions that, taken together, looked less like a theft and more like a person borrowing space from memory and then forgetting to pay the memory back. Mark said, careful as a man stepping on thin ice. That reflections can mislead. Martinez nodded without argument. She said that reflections can also remind. Outside the room, the mall's holiday music swung through its familiar chorus. Somewhere beyond the corridor, a barista called a name with cheerful pride. The world kept its errand. Inside, Brooks asked to see the corridor feed for the same window of time. The screen surrendered another angle, the open mouth of the store, the polished floor mirroring lights, the tide of coats rocking toward escalators. Victoria appeared at the threshold, shifted her bag, reached into it, and glanced around in the particular quick way of someone who does not plan to lose whatever she is not finding. Again, not proof, but shape. Brooks did not draw conclusions aloud. He let silence bring its own emphasis. Then he asked a question that did not accuse and did not comfort. It simply asked the room to be honest with itself. Had anyone attempted to alter or erase recorded material since the complaint began? Mark said the system required credentials he did not have. Martinez almost gently asked whether anyone had tried. Kyle's throat worked before his voice did. He said, no, not yet. Martinez thanked him with a look that made gratitude feel like permission to keep telling the truth. She opened an evidence bag, labeled it, and asked Kyle to start a protected export of the relevant clips. He did so, narrating each small step in a low voice as if reading to the room from a manual that had never been printed but should have been. Harker cleared his throat and announced that, while he appreciated cooperation, the practical matter remained a reported theft and that he intended to complete his incident report with the facts as presented by the complainant. Brooks nodded to show that he had heard every syllable, then asked in the same calm tone whether the officer had documented that a guardian had not been present when restraint was applied to a minor. Harker replied that the restraint had been standard, brief, and in the interest of safety. Monique's gaze did not sharpen, it steadied. She repeated, a shade slower, that the restraint had been applied without a guardian, that it had been unnecessary, and that it had introduced harm while contributing no facts. The word harm did not rise. It settled. The doorframe filled for a moment with the presence of Chief Robert Ellis, whose face wore the look of a man who has seen too many versions of the same preventable mistake. He introduced himself in a voice that gave the room a spine. He listened without interrupting as Brooks summarized the procedural concerns and, as Monique stated, without heat, the sequence of events from the point of view of a parent and a professional. The chief asked Harker whether he had examined nearby footage promptly, whether he had allowed a guardian to be present during questioning, and whether he had documented the reasons for restraint. Each question landed with the soft thud of a careful hammer. Harker's answers fit within the outlines of his training, but they did not fit the room that had formed here. The chief requested Harker's badge and duty weapon for temporary surrender pending review. The surrender felt formal, but not theatrical, the way a door is closed with a latch that insists on a second push. Out in the corridor, the rumor of something happening drew a slow ring of onlookers. Phones rose and fell, some recording, some pretending not to. The mall's public address voice announced extended hours as if that were the most important news in the building. Inside the room, the triangle of authority, civilian, military, and family found its balance. Brooks asked Martinez to take brief recorded statements from the people present, beginning with staff. She started with Kyle. His glance at Mark lasted the length of a heartbeat, then he began. He said that earlier in the day, he had been told to keep a closer eye on certain shoppers. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The word certain did what it always does when it is used like that. It marked a line without painting it. The chief's pen paused. Brooks's head turned by a fraction. The air shifted, as if the room had moved an inch closer to the center of the story. Martinez asked Kyle to be specific. He swallowed, then nodded. He said that the instruction had not named anyone out loud but had pointed with phrasing that left little doubt. He said he had not wanted to believe it mattered. He said he could not unhear it now. Mark started to protest that nothing official had been communicated. The sentence died at the edge of his tongue. It looked beyond rescue on the floor. Martinez thanked Kyle again and sealed his statement as if she were setting aside a fragile document for safekeeping. Brooks returned to the evidence on the table, to the simple trail that stubbornly refuses to step out of the way for narratives that move more easily without it. He asked for another call to be placed to the missing device on speaker, and suggested that the short walk from the security room to the display table and then to the corridor be retraced while the sound was listened for. No one argued. The store seemed to lean forward to hear itself. Sean O'Connor dialed the number from the service desk and turned the volume to its highest setting. The small speaker offering a brave chime that sounded almost like a child clearing a throat to speak in front of a class. They moved together out of the gray room and into the brighter air of the store. The first ring threaded itself through the low hum of purchases and holiday melodies. It was not an easy sound to catch. It did not try to be the loudest truth in the room. It tried only to be true. The group paused near the display table. No answer. The second ring followed, a twin voice refusing to lose its courage. It did not come from the table. It did not come from the floor. Martinez turned her head the way a field nurse listens for the faintest change in the monitor. A third ring joined them, traveling just far enough to make a direction. Heads turned with it. The sound led them through the short distance to the threshold, into the corridor, where the reflections of lights played on polished stone like small rivers. The fourth ring arrived from the region of a winter white scarf and a white shopping bag. It was not dramatic. It was not theatrical. It was simply obvious, the way daylight is obvious. The room did not gasp. The room did not need to. The human ear knows when a sound has come home. Martinez lifted a palm-to-pause movement, then spoke with courtesy and precision. She asked Miss Blake to hold still a moment. She asked permission to check the bag for the source of the ringing. Victoria's mouth pressed into a carefully arranged line. She said there must be an explanation. She said the sound could be from a nearby device. The fifth ring came from the bag again, pulling modestly at attention like a child tugging a sleeve. Martinez raised her brows a fraction. Victoria's hands moved as if of their own accord. She opened the bag. A phone gleamed inside among layered purchases. A candle tin, a folded sweater, a ribbon worn from handling, and certainty failing its performance. Silence is not always a vacuum. Sometimes it is a verdict wrapped in kindness. People in the nearest circle did not cheer. The veteran with the cap removed it for a second and smoothed the bill as if he were straightening a flag. The little boy in the puffer jacket stopped humming his superhero theme and looked from face to face, learning early that justice often speaks in indoor voices. Brooks asked gently that the device remain where it was while a photograph documented its position. Martinez snapped the image with the efficiency of a practice hand, then lifted the phone, still glowing with a missed call. She read the lock screen name silently and then aloud. It matched the number Mark had dialed earlier. The record became paper and image and audio at once, not because the truth needed help, but because people do. Victoria began a sentence with the words, "I must have," and the sentence wandered in circles until it stopped near "I forgot." She put her hand to her temple as if a headache might explain the shape of the afternoon. Mark took a small step backward without meaning to, the way a man rebalances when a cable gives way on one side. The chief did not raise his voice. He instructed an officer outside the frame to escort Miss Blake to a quiet office for a formal statement, and to ensure that her rights were read with the same care one gives to a fragile object. The note of kindness in his words did not reduce their firmness. He turned to Harker and asked, once more but without malice, whether the report he had planned to file still sounded accurate to his own ears. Harker studied the floor's reflection until it gave no more comfort. He did not answer quickly. Aaliyah stood near the display table, her hands resting on the metal edge, palms open as if continuing a promise she had made to herself hours ago. Monique's presence beside her carried heat the way a hearth does, steady, not consuming. Brooks noted the time in words, the way lawyers do when they plan to recall a day long after the holiday decorations have been changed for spring banners. Martinez sealed the evidence bag around the photograph device and marked the tag with a simple sequence of details. Kyle exhaled, a quiet sound he had been holding behind his teeth. Sean nodded once, as if to an old friend. The ring of onlookers in the corridor performed the civic ritual of trying not to stare, while also staying ready to tell someone later that they had been there. Some filmed, some folded their phones and chose to witness with their faces instead. The mall's music did not know how to change key for this, so it did not try. It continued with cheerful obligation. A light snow had started outside, flakes landing on the long glass of the atrium like small notes written to winter. Back in the gray room, Brooks asked for brief, recorded statements to continue. First the staff, then the complainant, then the witnesses, then the minor and her guardian if they wished. He asked that copies of the footage be made and that a receipt be signed for each one. He asked that the restraint be documented in detail, including the timing relative to guardian contact. He did not scold the room. He gave it a path out of the story it had built for itself, a path paved with steps that would not forget what it had learned today. Monique requested, calmly, that Aaliyah's wrists be examined by on-site medical staff and that the incident number be provided in writing. The chief agreed. He asked the clerk at the register to print the incident sheet. The clerk moved with the soft gratitude of a person given a useful task in a difficult hour. Martinez turned to Kyle once more and thanked him with words this time, not just a look. She told him that clarity is contagious and that he had chosen well. He nodded, eyes bright without tears, the way relief looks when it is not sure it is allowed to be seen. Outside, the ring of people in the corridor thickened at the edges. A pair of college students narrated softly to a camera for friends who would not be able to imagine all this without moving pictures. An elderly couple held hands and took a single step closer, then stopped themselves and stepped back again, remembering that dignity is a distance as much as a posture. A man in a local news jacket lifted the microphone and scanned the storefronts for a place to set up a quick live spot. News finds its angles the way water finds a channel. Aaliyah breathed in held, breathed out, the rhythm her mother had taught her when she was 13 and felt the world press close. She looked at the monitors, and then at the door, and then at the place on the table where her school identification still rested. She did not feel victorious. She felt something steadier and more useful. Weight leaving a scale, a story returning to its rightful narrator, the sound of a small bell that had refused to stop ringing until someone answered it. Monique rested a hand on the back of her chair, a touch that meant it is over for now, and also it is not over yet. The hallway's hum rose a notch, and then gathered itself into a thread of sentences carried by people with cameras, by people with microphones, by people with nothing but their own voices. The thread moved toward the doorway and held there. A small crowd that knew it had become part of a larger crowd that would hear about this before the end of the day, before the end of the weekend, before the holiday had gathered everyone home to tell what they had seen. A reporter called from the doorway, voice pitched to cut through the room without cutting it open, and gave the afternoon its next fact. This story is exploding across Twitter with the hashtag number Justice for Aaliyah. The courthouse smelled faintly of furniture polish and paper, that careful combination that tells a citizen their record will be kept and their voice will be heard. Winter had thinned into late season light by the time the case reached a downtown courtroom, and Chicago wore its gray with a kind of weary pride. Reporters arranged themselves along the back benches with notebooks ready but elbows tucked in. Families with errands to run later sat forward as if listening in church. Aaliyah Carter sat beside her mother at a narrow wooden table, her school identification tucked away at last, her wrists healed and warm. She listened to the soft shuffle of the bailiff, the measured murmur of lawyers, the distant hum of city traffic beyond the windows, and the occasional lift of a page that made the room sound like it was taking a breath. Major Anthony Brooks, in a trim suit that made him look like the argument he was about to make, leaned in to review a final point with Monique Carter. Captain Sophia Martinez waited a few rows back, the posture of a witness who had preserved what mattered and trusted the next step to carry it. The judge entered with the quiet gravity of someone who knows that justice travels best when it does not need spectacle. The clerk called the case in a voice that carried to every corner without hurrying any syllable. The facts, which had once tried to hide in the corners of reflections, now took their places in the center aisle. A video showing the complainant placing her own device in a shopping bag, a corridor feed that caught posture intent, a recorded trail of phone calls that ran to a location no one wanted to admit, a paper log of restraints applied to a minor without a guardian, a statement from a young security guard who had chosen his conscience over convenience. Each piece did not shout. Each piece took a chair and waited for its turn to speak. The room listened. Victoria Blake wore black as if color had become a burden. Her lawyer applied polish to the argument until it reflected like glass. Stress, confusion, the holiday rush, the weight of many packages, a simple mistake that anyone could have made. The words did what they could. They slid across evidence that had been gathered with a patience trained in rooms where truth arrives in layers. Officer Daniel Harker sat with his counsel as well, his report documented and then dismantled, his procedures described and then measured against the law's calm diagrams. Chief Robert Ellis's presence was a quiet spine along the back wall, a reminder that systems contain people and that people can learn, even when learning arrives with a cost. When the verdicts came, they arrived in the same measured tone that had carried the clerk's announcements. The judge found that Victoria Blake had made a false accusation that resulted in harm, and that an officer's restraint of a minor without a guardian present and without immediate evidentiary review had been improper and required discipline. The rulings were not designed to humiliate, they were designed to hold. The court ordered an apology written in plain language and not by a publicist, an acknowledgement posted where the harm had occurred, and a financial contribution to a scholarship fund that did not yet have a name but had already begun to live in conversations outside the courtroom. For the officer, suspension and mandatory training were imposed, along with a formal entry in a file that would no longer be a quiet drawer. The judge spoke about dignity the way an elder speaks about the weather everyone lives under, not as theory but as a condition. The court also turned to the mall, to Water Tower Place, that bright corridor of errands and wishes, and asked what it planned to learn from the afternoon when its lights shone on a mistake, and kept shining until the mistake could not pretend to be anything else. Counsel for the complex offered commitments, improved camera coverage for blind corners, immediate review protocols when accusations are made against minors, posted notices about guardianship rights, a stronger policy against profiling masked as prudence, training delivered not as a checkbox, but as a conversation led by people who have been made to carry too much suspicion too often. The judge nodded to each pledge as if setting a brick into a wall that would be tested by weather in years to come. Outside, the courthouse steps received the day the way wide stares always do, catching shoes and sentences and small bursts of relief. The wind off the lake made people turn up collars and tuck papers closer to their ribs. Reporters asked short questions designed to fit into the evening news. Words were careful. No one tried to make a hero out of a child who had asked only for her life to be measured by her actions and not by someone else's shadow. Aaliyah and Monique paused only long enough to thank the people who had chosen the harder version of their jobs. Then they folded into the city again the way citizens do, not as an event, but as a rhythm. In the weeks that followed, the story did what stories do when they are given a fair chance. It found conversations around dinner tables and in Sunday school classrooms. It sparked a meeting at a local library where a retiree with a veteran's cap spoke softly about rules and respect, and a teacher in a sweater with elbow patches explained how implicit bias can be a habit a person does not know they have. A group of students organized a forum at their high school and invited store managers from along Michigan Avenue to talk about training that could change the temperature of a room before it needed cooling. Letters to the editor arrived on plain paper and in careful emails. None of it felt like a wave. It felt like the steady accumulation of small good choices. And that is what democracy tastes like on an ordinary afternoon. The mall changed, not all at once and not without grumbling. New signage appeared near security posts that explained in clear language what a customer could expect if accused and how a minor's rights would be honored. A staff meeting on a rainy weekday brought together guards and clerks and managers who, for an hour and a half, listened more than they spoke. A video training module was retired and replaced by live sessions led by a nonprofit whose volunteers did not begin with shame. A quiet memo banned phrases like certain shoppers from security briefings. Kyle Matthews sat near the back with a notebook and took down words he planned to keep. Sean O'Connor spoke once, briefly, about dignity, and the room held still for a beat longer than expected. Spring found the city with its usual stubbornness, then summer did what summer does, and then the year turned. On a weekend before the next Thanksgiving, the atrium at Water Tower Place filled not with a rumor of trouble, but with chairs set in careful rows. A small stage rose near the glass where holiday lights would soon glow again. A sign on an easel carried the name in clear letters, the Carter Scholars Fund. People arrived in the layered way communities do. A choir director with programs under her arm, a youth pastor with a grin he could not put away, a librarian with a stack of envelopes, neighbors who had seen the winter news and wanted to see what happened to it. A coffee kiosk sent out a curl of cinnamon and warmth. The veteran with the cap found a chair near the aisle and tapped it once with the back of his hand, approving the sturdiness. When Aaliyah walked onto the small stage, she did not look older so much as more settled in her skin. She wore a simple dark dress and a pair of flats that would let her stand without thinking about standing. Monique stood to one side, not as an officer and not as a symbol, but as a mother who had learned where to place her hands when a crowd looks forward. Chief Ellis had come with his best tie and his careful smile. Major Brooks and Captain Martinez were there as well, not at a table this time, but in the fifth row, looking like friends who had earned their seats. Mark Peterson sat near the back in a clean jacket, eyes lowered, then raised, then lowered again, a man taking in a lesson that had chosen a public classroom. Kyle took a seat near the aisle, the notebook in his pocket even now. Not because he expected to take notes, but because he liked to be ready. Aaliyah spoke the way snow falls when there is no wind, gently and all at once. She did not describe the worst moment of that afternoon or repeat the lines that had hurt. She talked about science and patience, about circuits that require a resistor to keep them from burning out, about people who can be the resistor a system needs. She talked about how a community can be a kind of cooling fan if it chooses. She thanked her teacher for the gift card that had covered those components. thank the clerk who had offered a small smile at the register, thank the guard whose hands knew how to stay visible, thank the young man who told the truth when truth would have preferred to put his head down and wait for another day. Then she read the names. The first class of Carter scholars stood one by one, as she called them, each with a short note about a project that had made a light come on in a classroom, or in a parent's kitchen, or in a mine that had been waiting for permission, a girl who loved water chemistry and wanted to test the fountains in her neighborhood, a boy who had taught himself to solder by watching his grandfather fix old radios, a quiet student who had learned to code without saying the word out loud and now wanted a laptop to carry to the public library. Each name was a small bell rung clearly. Each face was a shape of possibility made visible. People clapped in the same warm register they had once used to mark birthdays and baptisms and retirements. No one stood on a chair. No one needed to. The room made a pocket of weather and kept it. When the applause settled, the veteran with the cap stood carefully and asked the privilege of a word. The event had not planned for this, but the event made room, because that is what a good event does. He spoke about years when he had believed that keeping order was the whole task, and about the day he learned that keeping order is sometimes the same as keeping safe, and sometimes it is not. He said he wished he had learned it sooner. He sat back down, and the room gave him the kind of applause a person receives when they have handed over something that cost them to carry. Afterward, people linger the way they do when a room has felt better than the weather outside. Folks from the choir brought plates of cookies. The library staff set up a small table to register students for winter programs, and the coffee kiosk surprised everyone by posting a sign that said a portion of proceeds that day would go to the fund. The mall's management team, a little stiff in their holiday sweaters, shook hands sincerely and promised not to let the new policies sag when the season got busy. A small banner near the information desk read, "Safe shopping for everyone," in letters big enough to find without squinting. In the late afternoon, when the chairs had been stacked and the last of the program leaflets had been carried away in coat pockets and tote bags, Aaliyah and Monique stood at the glass railing and looked out at the city they had not chosen to leave. Snow had begun, gentle as if remembering last year. For a while, neither spoke. They watched the child press his palms to the warm pane and say wow to the lights. Somewhere below, a bus exhaled a tired cloud and then moved on. Aaliyah thought about the room where her hands had been arranged to look like a story someone else had written for her. Then she thought about the room where she had said names into a microphone and watched possibility nod back. It did not feel like victory. It felt like repair. They walked together toward the escalator and descended into the soft noise. People nodded, some recognizing them, most not, which is a kind of freedom. A woman at the coffee kiosk called out that there was one last cup with cinnamon set aside if they wanted it. They smiled and shook their heads. The air tasted of winter and sugar. Somewhere a teenager rehearsed a line for a school play about courage. Somewhere a manager counted change and checked the schedule twice. Somewhere a security guard reminded a new hire that certain is a word to be careful with. The city collected these small motions and kept them. Evening settled early. The lake sent in its usual wind. The lights did their part without understanding why. Monique's phone buzzed with a polite message from a reporter who wanted a quote for the nightly broadcast. She turned the phone face down on a table and let the request rest. The scholarship banner had been taken down and would be put up again when the next class was announced in spring. Aaliyah slipped her hand through her mother's arm in a gesture that belonged to both of them equally. And together, they stepped into the stream of people heading toward doors, toward trains, toward home. If it were you, would you stay silent and accept it? Or stand up so that justice can be brought to light? In the quiet after the verdict, what lingered was not the sound of a gavel, but the image of a young girl standing beside her mother, no longer weighed down by suspicion, but lifted by the steady truth of dignity restored. The story reminded all who watched that injustice can slip into everyday places, stores, hallways, even polite conversations. And yet, when patience is joined with courage, light finds its way into the darkest corners. Its lesson is simple and enduring. When love steadies our hands, when we admit mistakes and choose repair over pride, we make the world safer for every child to walk freely. Like a lantern in a window on a winter's night, a single act of fairness can guide many weary travelers home. So let us pause and consider the quiet kindnesses around us And if this story has touched your heart, share its warmth with someone who may be waiting for the reminder that justice, once spoken aloud, belongs to us all.